Hey folks, Jeffrey Miss with Northman here again. This should be part 4 of our gear and equipment setup. This time is about the sled itself. So we've been over the clothing, we've been over the pack, and then what gear, or I should say tools, and parts that I keep on the sled. So part 4 here is how I've set up the sled itself. And I'm not going to get into too much detail as far as how to do like suspension adjustments and anything. We are going to go over that real quick, but I'm not going to get into those details. A lot of that information can be found on your owner's manual, things like that. But there are some key takeaways that you do need to know. Before we get into that though, I'm just going to go over how I've set up this sled and why. So first off, you know, I'm a big fan of bumpers. If you've rode with me, you'll know that I love trees. And then I'm not talking about tree hugging, well, I do care about trees in that respect too, but I do end up hitting a few trees. I've taken out more than one bumper, put it that way. So first and foremost, one of the first things I do on any sled is get a set of front and rear bumpers. Now these are from, there's a whole bunch of manufacturers out there. These are from Backwoods BMP over in Maine. I like their fit and finish. They're quick to respond when I have issues in terms of ordering another bumper, for example. And I like their color selection and the style. So everything's a win-win. So I do run on both sleds, or all my sleds, I run a front and rear bumper on those, mostly to protect the front. And on that note, yes, they do work 100% as advertised. I think I have a video of that I haven't posted yet. I believe it was on Instagram last year, but the bumpers do exactly what they're intended to do. They save your bacon and transmit the energy from the tree. Instead of putting it straight into your bulkhead or your exhaust, for example, these literally, you can see it, they push up and out, and that's exactly what they advertise. Yeah, I've replaced a number of those already, and no damage to the plastic or the bulkhead or the exhaust or anything else on the sled. So I swear by them. They're 100% worth the money. I don't care what brand you go. It's a personal preference, but front and rear bumpers is what I run. Beyond that, moving back, I don't know if you can see them. I'm one of the few people that I know that run gauntlets, or not gauntlets, but hand guards on my handlebars. And a lot of that is, most of the riding we do is in pretty deep snow. The trees, we're not hitting trees too much. I mean, we're not trying to squeeze through gaps that small or anything. So it's not so much to protect your hands, but it is to keep your hands dry. The wetter your gloves are, the more they're gonna get frozen up, and I like warm hands. The other component to it, especially on these new Matrix models, they do have a throttle block. This is a 2024, so there was some freezing up issues on the throttle block. I know Polaris has revised their throttle block. I don't know if that's an issue still with the new design. We don't have enough snow to really test that out. But it helps me keep from the throttle getting locked up from ice. And then on the brake side, there is a little indentation where there's a sensor for the brake, and that has frozen up on me multiple occasions. I haven't had an issue with the throttle block, but with or without the gauntlet or the handguards, I have had that issue with that sensor getting frozen up. And what that does is it makes the sled think that the brake is on when it's not, and then it goes into safe mode and then can shut the sled down, and it's a pain in the butt. There's a couple solutions to it. I haven't gotten to the point where I put in a little dab of silicone or anything, because that needs to be open, but I have the handguards angled in such a way that it hasn't been a problem. I also made it a habit to spray, believe it or not, cooking spray, PAM, on both the throttle block and that little sensor on the brake. That seems to have solved the problem. So if that helps you, by all means, keep using it. I also keep the throttle cable lubed properly and all that kind of stuff too. But the PAM, once I started using that, has basically stopped all problems with the frozen up throttle block or that brake sensor. So, but even so, I still run the hand guards mostly to keep my gloves dry. And again, we're not banging through trees that are like, 36 inches wide. we were going through the trees, but nothing like that. So I'm not a Chris Bryant by any means. So, all right, so moving to the back of the sled, or towards the back of the sled. I am also a huge fan of carrying extra fuel. I will always carry this. I found that on the 850, I didn't need it as much as I do on this 9R. I was actually giving fuel to my Arctic Cat buddies more than anything else. So, but I kept carrying it because you never know. We don't want to be towing out their sleds. You don't want to tow out yours. And if carrying an extra 2.5 gallons of fuel keeps that from happening, great. There's also some other solutions out there, those soft bladders. We've played with the idea of strapping a soft bladder on these, going out 20, 30 minutes and then topping off, or keep using that bladder, staging it somewhere by a tree or something. So we have it on the way back so we can get back to the truck. So I haven't gotten to that point yet. We've never made it that close, but we have been down well under a quarter tank, even with dipping into these things. So yeah, an extra tank is very much important. I'll also be remiss to say, or not to say, that these tank racks, we actually make them in-house. Hatcher Pass Polaris carries them for you guys to mount on both the Axis model and the Matrix. So just throwing that out there, little bit of an advertisement, but Polaris doesn't make these racks anymore for these types of tanks. So this is kind of one of the only options, at least you have up here in Alaska. So if you're in Alaska, need a tank, Hatcher Pass Polaris, talk to Chris, she'll get you set up. So the advertisement out of the way. We already went over the tank, or the tunnel bag right here. So I'm not going to go over that, but I'm a big fan of the new lock and ride system from Polaris. I mean, literally, if you want to do some climbs and you don't want to carry an extra, 20, 30 pounds of weight, just take that off, do your climb, pop it back in, and you're back up and running again. So huge fan of this. I have this modified over to bolt onto the Axis sled. It's the same system. It's just a little, instead of it being integral onto the, like the new Matrix sleds, you have the rail system on the Axis. They work the same. Big fan. And let's see if you can see it. Here's the rear bumper right here on both sleds. And you can, and this is probably more important on the Axis than it is on the Matrix. The Matrix tunnel is significantly stiffer than the Axis model. I'm sure that the other brands are pretty similar as they've gotten into lighter tunnels and things like that. The Axis model, basically you have a multi-layered tunnel over there. It's significantly stronger in OEM form. And the Matrix, they went over to basically a single layer of metal. So you don't have the strength in the Matrix. Granted, you're also running the slash and a shorter tunnel on the newer sleds too. But even so, if you're doing a lot of wheelies, if you're doing, a lot of flip overs, that kind of thing, or if you're just towing, these bumpers are probably necessary. And they extend, if you can see, they extend well past the brake angle in front of the floorboard. So that's a huge deal when you're talking about strength and rigidity. So again, these are backwoods BMP. I'm not sponsored by anybody, so as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what you're running. Just pick your flavor of choice, basically. But that's what I run. I do not run rail stiffeners or anything like that. I'm not a big jumper. I like the natural drops, things like that. And even at 260 pounds, I haven't had any issues on either sled as far as the rail strength. But I do know that the aftermarket has a plethora of rail stiffeners, or even just aftermarket skids if you need them. For my riding style and for what I do, I haven't needed that. So so that's really, as far as setup is concerned, that's pretty much the sled. Except for what I did not cover actually in one of the other videos is I'm shocked at how many people don't do this, but there's an extra belt and 2 extra spark plugs in the front. They have a little carrier. Every brand has them. Just put an extra belt and some plugs in there. It saves everybody a lot of trouble. I'm shocked when people don't do that. So part of your sled, and I should have covered it under the equipment side, but yeah, just carry an extra belt and your plugs. That's why they have that little carrier up underneath the hood. So the only other thing I've done to this sled that that really is considered, I guess, a build in a way is the exhaust. I do have a can on there just to, you know, lighten it up a little bit more. I've noticed not so much on the top end horsepower range, but I do notice some throttle response issues. I like fast throttle response, so that's why I'm running a 9R, not a turbo. But I can see the can. It's $200, $250. You save what is it, 17 pounds of weight and gain an extra couple horses. I'm not so much worried about the horses as I am about the weight, but the snappier throttle response goes a long way. So I think you saw that in part 3 when I showed you the cooker that I have strapped to that bad boy. And again, your flavor of choice. There's a ton of different brands out there. I chose MBRP, again, not sponsored, but I like the tone better. It's a little bit deeper tone than your other SLPs or GBBs, that kind of stuff. It's just, I like this sound better. The performance, you're gonna get the same across the board regardless, as far as I'm concerned. So so that's really about it on the actual suspension, or I'm sorry, not the suspension, but the setup. These aren't built sleds. I don't have a whole bunch of aftermarket parts for them. In OEM form, they're everything you really need, unless you're up there at the Chris Brandt and Caleb Kristecki level. You don't really need anything. And in fact, I think that Caleb actually runs his sleds mostly stock to begin with. So that might be changing now that he's riding a lot more with Chris. But for my purposes, this sled, both of these sleds are phenomenal. The only thing I am changing on the axis is I am upgrading to the QD2 setup. And I will likely replace the old Series 6 2.6 track that came with it, and go ahead and put the Series 8 2.75 on that one. That track tends to trench really, really badly, and I haven't had this trouble on the new Matrix with the Series 8. So more than likely, if I ever get another, you know, $2,000 of extra cash, I'll replace the driver and the track and get that on that sled. But for right now, that one's pretty much done. Low-hanging fruit was that QD2 setup, so I do have that. I haven't put it on yet, but that's next. That's later on this week, actually. So probably end up doing a video for that. But, unremarkable in that respect. It's basically just regearing to get the lower end and spooling up faster at the bottom end rather than the top end. So these aren't rocket ships. You're going to top out about 75, 78 miles an hour anyway. If you want to go faster, you get yourself an Assault or an XCR or something like that, and then you'll be up there. But these are mountain sleds. You want grunt and torque. So okay, so with the basics down as far as the sled setup, again, these aren't anything special, but I can't stress one thing enough, and that's suspension setup. That goes a huge, long way as far as how the sled is going to react for you, and your just overall enjoyment. If you don't like what the sled is doing, more often than not, it's because the suspension is set up incorrectly. So first thing I do on every sled, and when I buy it, I reset everything. I set up, I go back to basics, and this comes back from my motorcycle racing days on the road course with AMA way long time ago. So you have on the higher end sleds nowadays, you have a bunch of different settings. You have your sag, your preload, which is kind of the same thing. And then you have your high and low speed compression. On top of that, you have 3 sets of shocks on here. You have your front shocks on your skis, you have your front shock on your track, and your rear shock on your track. All of those changes how the sled reacts in different snow conditions and on your riding style. So first and foremost, make sure your preload, if you have that option on your sled, make sure your preload is set up for the proper amount of sag. And depending on your riding style, generally the amount of sag you want is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Now on the OEM sleds, OEM shocks, as they come from the factory, I'm at a disadvantage, 260 pounds. I'm kind of on the high end. So in order to get the sled set up the way I want, I have 2 options: really crank down on the preload, or order, not an aftermarket spring, but order another spring with a higher rate spring to deal with my weight. I don't do that. I just crank up the preload till I get to the sag that I want. And I'm sitting right at about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches on both of these sleds. They're pretty much set up identical. So what that does is it gets the sled ready for your weight. Again, 260 pounds, I'm gonna have a much different setting than someone that's weighing, you know, a buck 30 or so, a buck 65. Most of the guys I ride with, I'm outweighing by 80 to 100 pounds. So my setups are going to be a little bit different, but that doesn't change the fact that preload is important. So once you have the preload set up, then you have your other settings, and which is the high and low speed compression on your shocks itself. Some of these you can kind of take up on the preload, but we don't. That's a whole nother level of detail that probably I don't want to get into on this video. There is some things you can take care of with preload, but again, your rule of thumb is 1 inch to 1.5 inches of sag, and that's adjusted through your preload. So that's it. So you have a bunch of different options on how you like to ride and how the shocks are set up, beyond the preload anyway. So your front shocks are mostly for your tipping, right? If you're doing a lot of trails, it's not going to matter too much on the mountain sleds, but it is a balance because a lot of the times you're going on a trail to get to the sled or to get to the deep snow, and these sleds aren't set up for trails, and so you're probably like me. Are going to have problems with inside ski lift, things like that. Well, that's all adjusted through your high and low speed compression, and to a certain extent your preload, but mostly on your compression settings. I keep them pretty soft because it's not like I'm bounding down the trails at 80, 90 miles an hour, and I'm not taking corners very fast with this sled anyway. They're narrow, they're tippy to begin with. But if I'm doing a lot of that, then I might crank them up a little bit, your low speed compression, to compensate for that kind of stuff. I'll get to that in a second. On your track though, you have 2 shocks on your track. You have a front shock and a rear shock. And how you set those up is gonna impact how playful the sled is versus how stable the sled is. And when I say playful, I'm talking about wheelies, hopovers, re-entries, things like that. Stability, I'm talking about pointing up, straight up a hill and going up without, being all over the place. Both of these sleds are chaoses, so they're kind of playful to begin with. The Pro RMKs are set up mostly to go straight up a hill. It's just how they are. I like the playfulness of it. I like being able to turn on a dime a little bit easier. My riding style is in the transition zone between tree and alpine, where you have spaced out trees. That's where I ride 90% of the time. And so I have, my sled set up for that. So if you're wanting more front ski lift, and we're talking wheelies and things like that, if you want it to be more playful, you want to set up your front and rear shocks on your track. You want a stiffer front and a softer rear, and that's on your compression ratings. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. If you want less ski lift, so basically on these sleds, if I want to go straighter, I have to soften up the front and stiffen up the rear shock on the track. You can do that on the mountain. It's easy enough to do. I've just kind of found the happy medium. I don't like going straight up as much. I'm not a high marker. I don't play in the chutes very often. I like playing in the trees where you want to stay light and nimble. That's just where my situation is. But if you want to make those adjustments, that's the rule of thumb. More wheelie, stiffer front, softer rear, less wheelie, softer front, stiffer rear. So I'm kind of on the more wheelie side, but not completely wheelie, because it can get to the point, especially on the 9R, where all you're doing is wheeling, and then you're not getting anywhere. But it might look cool, but it's really tough to go uphill and maneuver if all you're doing is wheeling. So you got to find that balance for you. Now on the higher end sleds, you're going to have, like on these, they all have the Walker Evans. They will have high and low speed compression. So that's going to impact how the shock reacts to bumps. High speed compression, it has nothing to do with the speed that you're going. This has all to do with the relative speed of the shock itself and how it's relating to the topography, what's underneath you, the snow conditions, the bumps, things like that. So high speed compression is things like landing a big jump, going down trails with lots of moguls, sudden bumps. If you're riding down what you thought was a nice smooth area, and then there's a buried log or something, and it's that jarring effect. So it's the speed at which the shock is moving, right? It's not the speed that you're moving, but the shock itself. So obviously with if you do more jumps, more bumps, things like that, you're going to want to crank up the high speed compression. The low speed compression is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. That is the long, slow transitions, like if you're on a trail or off camber, and it's that nice long sloping, and you're kind of coming over the rise, and then you're going back into a depression area. The suspension travel, the shock is not acting fast, it's acting nice, slow, and smooth. So that's where your low speed compression is. That would also take into account acceleration, braking, things like that. So two different settings for two different purposes. Don't get them mixed up because they do impact. They do impact you. Now, they kind of coincide a little bit with your preload, otherwise known as your sag that I talked about earlier. So you really kind of have to set all that up to your riding style. My setup on these sleds is going to be much, much different than my buddy Chris's, not only because of his weight, but we ride differently. So you're going to have to play with it. I tend to like a little bit more higher speed compression and low speed compression than other folks, but that's a lot of it because I weigh a lot. So when I hit a jarring bump or moguls on the trail or something like that, because of my weight, that shock is working harder and faster. So I need to bump up the high speed compression a little bit more. In my experience, where I typically ride, the low speed compression doesn't really come into play too much. So I don't tend to worry about it, though it is set up. And I found a pretty happy medium actually both these sleds are pretty much set up identical as far as high and low speed compression, as well as the sag. Yeah, you got a little bit of a weight difference, but a couple pounds on the sled is not going to make a big difference when I weigh 260. So these sleds are set up identical. For me, they ride the same. The only difference that I've noticed beyond the track anyway is that the axis, because it's not the slash, on the side hilling, I do get caught up a little bit more, but that's why they make the slash. It's not as prevalent because I tend not to side hill too much, but I can hop on either one of these sleds and they're going to perform basically the same, even though one's an 850, the other one's a 9R. So obviously the 9R I have found to be a phenomenal sled. It suits my riding style very, very well. And at the altitudes, I have gotten up to, the 5,000-6,000 foot level, and you do notice a difference, especially for me with the weight. But our riding is typically between 3 and maybe 4,500. 9 times out of 10, that's where we're at. So I have not felt the need to go up to a boost. I'd rather have the nimbleness and lower end grunt that the 9R provides that the boosts do not. So maybe one day I'll get a boost, or I'll put a boost kit on the axis, who knows. But for right now, I'm all NA, naturally aspirated, and I'm happy with that. These sleds do everything that I want them to do and more. I'm constantly learning. My self-confidence, once I switched over to this axis, has boosted so much more. I'm willing to do things on this sled that I would never even have thought about on the older sled. I hang on to it because it's a paid off backup sled, but I'll always reach for this throttle before that one. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked. So that's kind of not a short one, but it's kind of a summary of how I have the sled set up and a little bit of a history on what the preload does, the high and low speed compressions. I highly recommend you, before you start blaming the sled itself, if you have the ability to adjust your preloads, adjust your high and low speed compressions, go back to zero, start over. It makes a world of difference in how the sled responds to your inputs. So I'll get off my soapbox on that one. Do some research, and maybe I'll get a video up there on how to do all that. But for right now, that's the gist. Thanks for watching. Comment if I'm forgetting anything or you want to see something else, or if you run a different setup, let me know. This works for me, might not work for everybody. Some people like full-on builds, other people stick with OEM. They don't even run a can. So it's all to what you like, what your desires are. And that's what I love about this sport, is that you can do everything from 100% bone stock to full-on wild out builds. It's crazy, but motorsports are like that. So that's why I'm in them. Anyway, all right, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think about my setups, what my summary is. This is the 4th video. I don't think there's going to be a 5th, but there may be. It depends on how what else I might have forgotten in these first 4, and we'll go from there. But yeah, that's the gist. And hopefully this storm it's dropping some rain right now, but hopefully it's dropping a lot of snow up in the mountains, because we need that. And we'll get this out this next weekend, this upcoming weekend, and actually do some riding. So fingers crossed. Until then, for those of you who are riding, ride safe. Hope this helps everybody. And yeah, like I said, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks, everybody.